Awesome. So I think we'll just get started now. So welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by ITE-ANZ. So the topic today is on transport equity, and we're really excited to have Takeshi here from ARIP. I will be your moderator today. Just a couple of things from me. So for those of you that don't know much about ITE, we are an international membership of transportation professionals. So there's a big base in the US and Canada, but we also have a section here in Australia and New Zealand. So yeah, 17,000 members across 75 countries, and we're always welcoming new members. So you see our links down at the bottom. If you are interested in signing up, just let us know, and we'd be happy to have you. Just quickly, we'd like to thank our sponsors, so Austraffic, Traffic Works, Sidra, O'Brien Transport, Lindsay Oxland Consulting, and Movement in Place Consulting. So we're really thankful for these guys that keep us running, year in, year out. Just a bit of housekeeping from me. So you will be automatically muted, and if you have any questions and answers, you can pop them in the question and answer bubble, or the chat, but preferably the question and answer bubble, because that just helps us be able to put them in the right place, the answers in the right place. So after the presentation, there will be a question and answer section. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, just pop them in the question and answer box, and they'll be answered at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to our presenter today. So yeah, welcome, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Maddie. Can you hear me? All good?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, I will share my screen if I make this work. There. Is this all working? Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm really grateful to be given the opportunity to talk about equity in transport or equity in planning. As equity becomes a bit of a buzzword, I thought it's a great opportunity to talk about the principle of equity, which is often the race, gender, and class. So today I'll be talking more sort of focusing on the roots of and principle of equity. So that's 80%. And I'm going to take you through some of good practice happening in this global, in the world. So I also going to be referring a lot of context from the US and apply to New Zealand. Unfortunately, I can't apply to Australia context because I'm in New Zealand at the moment. When you look at the US and New Zealand, we actually share so much. We have a commonality in terms of our social fabric and history. Yeah, I also note some materials that I take you through might be uncomfortable to some of you, but I talk about it because it's time for our industry to change and pick up on that something that we don't often pick up in our practice. Okay, so with that being said, acknowledgement. I like to do acknowledgement of country for those in Australia, and I will do New Zealand karakia for those in New Zealand. We acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders people as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodian of the lands where people live, learn, and work. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and respect the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori as the original people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aoki runga, aoki raro, aoki tatoa katoa, kia tau ai te Maori o ngā atoa, te Maori o ngā tipuna, kia puta ki te whai ao, ki te ao marama whānau haramaete toki, hamie, huie, taikie. All right, before I dive into the material, a bit about me. So I'm a cisgender gay Asian male of immigrant. I was born in Tokyo, and then my parents moved to New York City in my mid-teens, and I moved to London to do my undergraduate courses, and then I moved back to New York and moved back to London, and I came to Auckland 5 years ago. And I'm about to embark on my next journey, which is San Francisco this year. As you can see in the photo, I've been dancing since I was 5. It's something that I love doing. My background is in social science, and I did urban planning and transport planning master degrees subsequently. So that's a bit about me. So equity, it's definitely becoming a buzzword. I closely follow this wonderful person, Tamika L. Butler. Sorry, I forgot to note, you see that a lot of QR codes. Please scan it, it will take you to the reference information. Okay, so Tamika is a civil rights lawyer turning into transport planner in the States. Her Nectar keynote speech from Seattle back in 2016 is one of the famous one, and I highly recommend you to watch. She says, equity is like shade of blue. Some people talk about baby blue and some people talk about navy blue. So it's really important we are on the same page when we talk about equity. So for me, for today, equity I'm referring to is a tool to redistribute power from people who have held the power for long. So what I mean is people usually get least should get the most. So equity and equality often get confused as well. And with equality, you give the same tool to everyone. But equity, you give different tool to people based on what they need. So it has an element closer to justice, as you can see in the picture there. So it's a lot about social system and a lot about social dynamics. So where this equity planning comes from, so it sort of existed under Title VI requirement of Civil Rights Act 1964 in the United States. Basically, Title VI bans the Fed funding to be used, Title VI bans Fed government funding to be used to discriminate against people based on race, color, or national origin. Why is that? Some of you might know unfortunate US history of segregation. And unfortunately, urban planning was one of the tools to be used to segregate communities. So you see this here, racial covenant, it's explicitly saying person of color cannot occupy or, buy land or this building. So 60 years later, year 2020, we unfortunately saw police murder of George Floyd, which subsequently led to Black Lives Matter, as we know. And this is when urban planning as an institution was questioned, since it was used in the past as a tool of white supremacy. What our response? So a lot of urban planners looked at equity planning as a tool to shift away from color, gender, class-blinded approaches or policies. This is to seek more investment for underserved communities in the US. I'm going to come back to this point later in my presentation. So what planning actually did? You might know the redlining practice in the US. Basically, they identified certain areas shown in red as undesirable. And these areas often, people of color, low-income people using these areas. So if you are, say, person of color wanting to buy property in blue area, they have a right to refuse your application through mortgage application typically. And these areas were, are considered as undesirable. So they didn't get enough funding. So today, even today, these areas, as you can see in the maps on the right, these areas still experience higher pollution and higher road injuries because it's didn't get enough investment. So applying that, looking at Auckland through that lens, when we didn't have a such policy, but when you look at where people live and their ethnicity, we actually live in such a segregated way. This is without segregation policy, right? And when you look at people's socioeconomic status in these areas, you immediately start seeing correlation between ethnicity and socioeconomic status. And then you look at public transport provision of these areas. Again, lower socioeconomic areas often do not get enough public transport. And then you look at where the fatal crash is happening. Again, you start to see the correlation and concentration in part of Auckland, where you likely to see higher crash rate. And you wonder where the future investment would be made. It's really difficult to see from this picture on the right, but one has to question whether we are investing in the right place, and as in the place actually require the investment. There's a book called Color of Law, which I highly recommend. The author of the book, Richard Rothstein, says the public policy of yesterday still shape the racial landscape of today. And then at this point, you might be wondering why I'm talking about US context. And when we look at surface level, like iceberg level, in the US, you will see more louder, crazier discrimination in media. But when you look underneath of the iceberg, we actually have so much commonalities, and that's because we, Australia, New Zealand, US, experience colonization, and that often has a legacy, leaves a legacy as systematic discrimination at a deep level. So for New Zealand, as we know, our indigenous Maori people's lands were confiscated, and the Maori people also received smaller amount of old age pension back in the day. And that's similar for Chinese and Indian people. They couldn't receive pension at one point. And then more recently, Pacific Islanders in 70s, they were falsely accused of being overstays. And this has a consequence in our social fabric because often the wealth get generated over generations. So some people already coming from more difficult place. And as you can see, the weekly average income by ethnic groups, these groups still having financial issues today. So why it's got to do with infrastructure? The iconic Harbour Bridge in Auckland, it was built for cars, and unfortunately it is still for cars, which includes PT nowadays. But just think who were affluent enough to be able to buy cars in the 50s. And this bridge was built using public funding, basically for certain people to benefit. And so it's divided community by who can cross the bridge. And that's what infrastructure can do. As a transport planner engineers, we decide how people move. And unfortunately, often we use one size fits all approach. We often suggest people should walk more, cycle more. That's fair enough. But there are people in our society that prefer not to, not because of their preference. That could be because their social circumstances. In the United States, which I will talk about it, because racial profiling of enforcement officers, typically people of color are hesitant to walk, cycle, being public place. And that's often beyond what we can do, but then it's something that we need to think when we're working on a certain project. So while we do that, so often we planner, engineer come from a privileged social group. And the community often we work for, they have different social group. And this becomes the issue because we will struggle to understand their needs, how they live, because we basically live quite differently and brought up differently. And Tamika Butler says in the Nectar speech, if you feel uncomfortable talking about racial difference, probably you are because privileged. What she means is if you don't need to think about racial difference every day in your life, you're privileged because some people have to think about it because of their identity. And looking at the planning industry in the US, over 80% of urban planners identify themselves as white. And this is, as you can see in the graph, it's overrepresentation of one group. And similar picture in the UK, only 7% of urban planner identify themselves as person of color. And here in New Zealand, unfortunately, similar stats, we don't have it. And these are people who typically decide how we move in New Zealand. And look at their demography and look at New Zealand demography. It's extremely different. And this becomes an issue. It becomes a blind spot. This is one example. I am not going to play this video. It's very strong video. It's a body cam footage from the enforcement officer in Seattle, US, where it used to require cycle helmet wearing. They had to repeal it because of discriminatory enforcement against people of color. And this is exactly the footage. In this video, you will see car pulls out of car park, hit cyclist. I guess car driver wasn't checking properly. Police officer turned up and they immediately said, oh, the cyclist not wearing helmet. And the officer actually sent car driver home, you're good. And then they proceed with criminal proceeding with cyclist who is in extreme pain. You can hear him screaming. And you know why the officer chose a cyclist. It's not because helmet. He used that as his tactics. So looking at the traffic offenses in New Zealand, you immediately notice 40% offenses were given to our Maori people and 11% given to Pacific people. When you consider New Zealand demography, it's overrepresentation of certain groups. And this makes me really wonder, police, there are New Zealand police and their unconscious bias against people of color. There was an investigation went in a few years ago and came out last year, basically saying terms like systematic and structural racism not well understood by officers. And this is a problem for our industry because often we use enforcement as a part of our road safety program, and Vision Zero is one of them. It could be if police are racial profiling through the safety program, such as Vision Zero, we might be just burdening some people's life. And this is definitely the case in the US. Vision Zero in the US, some states are failing. They're just burdening people of color's life while roads are not getting safer. And some states are actually replacing enforcement with education, which is a more equitable approach. So this is an interesting table. This is how all OECD countries collect data around racial and ethnicity. And you immediately notice in most European countries here, except UK and Ireland Republic, do not collect racial and ethnicity data. And this is a bit of issue because for our industry, often we bring the best practice from Europe into our land, our side. And as you can see, Sweden, Vision Zero is from Sweden, I believe. And they don't need to correct this ethnicity data, and they get away with not doing it. And the implication of us applying such tool to our side of a society, there will be implication, as you've seen through Vision Zero. And this video is very interesting. It's from 1950s. They talk about prejudice. There's a segment where they talk about colonization. And the girl from the UK, she says, we thought we were helping you through our colonization. And the girl from Indonesia says, we didn't get to experiment to build our country. And this to me is often similar to our engagement strategies, our logic. We come up with options on designs, and we go to public and say, well, this is what you wanted, believe us. Well, how do we know? And as an industry, we have a tendency to believe on academic knowledge rather than community's voice. We love data. I love data. And data-driven decisions are great, but we have to be aware who is manipulating data, who is interpreting data. And often that weighs more than voice from a community. And that's the issue with the engagement strategy we often do. And looking at the bright side, in the US for the last 3 years, I guess, they made significant progress on equity. Under Biden and Harris administration, they created the initiative called Justice 40. It is to, the Justice 40 invests in 40% of the US population who is in lower socioeconomic status. To do this, they had to be explicitly identify who they consider as a disadvantaged communities who required investment. So this is shift away from color, class-blinded policies. We need to be explicit to help people. If you go to their dashboard, you will see all sort of interesting index and also identify where the money needs to go. Closer to home, I am currently working on equity assessment for Auckland, essentially identifying priority groups. So these are people who have been historically subject to systemic discrimination. So this is different from social vulnerability. Social vulnerability talks about current, whereas the equity analysis, we look at the past and apply to the to existing situation. So we worked closely with our treaty partners, that's the Māori advisors. We identified the priority groups, and we will be looking at a project, how the project will benefit, impact on priority groups, which we often don't do. We say, well, there will be safety improvement on community, but actually we don't often talk about who are these people. And now we are starting to talk about how these improvement, or could be, I hope it's not negative impact, but it can be, affect priority groups. And this is some example of safety analysis through equity lens. We identified priority groups, and that include Pacific peoples and Māori people in New Zealand. In terms of ethnicity, and we're looking at severe and fatal crashes, where this is happening, involving our priority groups, and also looking at their social facilities, the social facilities that relevant to them, not to us. We did so by talking to our treaty partner, but also colleague who has Pacific background, and she is from Auckland. And then literally listing the facilities relevant to Pacific people. So we did that. So I like to finish my presentation with 3 quotes. One quote is our own equity leader for planning and climate from San Francisco office, Megan G. I asked her when I finished my study in my 8 weeks course, I came back to project and I asked her, look, I am transport planner on this project and I see potential issues, but I'm not equity specialist. What can I do? I felt really overwhelmed, and helpless in some way. And her suggestion was, well, start with what you know it is right for people in your own role. Where I approach, I work very closely with our treaty partner for me to be able to understand multi-value. For me, I choose to work closely with Pacific colleague for me to understand their value and what important and make sure we are respecting and including in the decision making. So I think the equity practice can start from your personal level as well. And the other quote is from Audre Lorde. She says, there is no thing as single issue struggle because we don't live in single issue lives. She's talking about intersectionality. You know, some people live in certain area because of certain circumstances. And that's what she's talking about. And most famously, Jane Jacobs, of course, cities have the capacity of capability of providing something for everybody only when they are created by everybody. Thank you so much. That's all for me.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. You know, it's always really eye-opening to hear about that kind of stuff, and particularly from someone that's so, you know, you've got a lot of experience and, you know, academic knowledge as well as the work that you do as well. So just, I would like to encourage everyone to ask some questions in the question and answer box. We have about 30 minutes so far. Robert has said, congratulations on providing this session on such an important but neglected issue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really good point. We don't, yeah, as you said at the beginning, you know, we don't really talk about this as much as we should, and it's definitely cool to have, you know, particularly governments and you know, different organizations doing equity work as part of, you know, regular transport planning work as well. Okay, I have a question for you, just to kick it off. But yeah, as I said, please pop your questions in the question and answer box. What do you think is something that, oh, there's a question. Okay, there's a better question. David asked, how do immigrants' experiences differ from First Nations people? That's actually a very good question. Thank you, David.
Yeah, I guess I sometimes feel like an immigrant in Japan because I lived there 12 years only in my life. And I think difference is definitely different. The experience would be different. I mean, if you're immigrant, it depends on your immigration status. You are naturally become more vulnerable. You know, I experienced restructuring, and then that basically I could get kicked out because my immigration status, you know, is tied to employment, right? So I mean, that's general. As a transport planner and the way we move the space, it's not so much about maybe immigration status. So say how I move my public space, because I'm 170-meter height, and some like 2-meter, right? I am always aware in public space of my color and my size of body, because if anyone to attack me, Mari, I guess I think this is relevant to female colleagues here. I'm more aware because I potentially be targeted So that I feel the difference in public space. Yeah, I hope that I answered correctly.
No, I think that was a really good answer. Yeah, and yeah, it's always something. I think, particularly you talking about the immigration status thing, like that's such a huge part of the immigrant experience. So yeah, I think, yeah, no, that was a really good answer. So we do have a couple questions in the question box, which I will ask you now. So the first one is, so related to your work, equity analysis and index, how do we measure accessibility for certain groups of people, e.g. women or mothers? Are specific indicators different from general indicators in the measurement? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think what you
Okay.
can do with equity index, you can overlay the accessibility on the top of this index. So basically, if you are priority group, area with concentration of priority group, living in parts of your town with low public transport, and that means they will have very difficulty traveling because so the index includes access to vehicle, right? So if you don't have a car, if you have a low public transport accessibility, your life is very difficult for you to get to work or get to, go to place of worship or whatever. So yeah, so that's what I think. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that was a really good answer. So the next question I have for you is, this is from Anonymous. Are there any good examples of queer communities being redlined or otherwise marginalized due to other planning decisions?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Hmm. I think decision making process, right? And again, you look at who is making decision for food, and you ultimately encouraging queer communities to be part of decision making, which you might have seen, like you can't, from picture you don't know, in the Auckland, New Zealand case, but that's why I think inclusion, diversity at the workplace or decision making is important, so that decision makers, they understand more, be aware of the issues. I think that you can be doing that for like design as well. There are more inclusive designs. I myself not designer, so it's really hard to say it. But I think it's just diversity and inclusion, more of that, and that's really important, I think. Yeah, in our process. So in terms of specific areas, if that's the question, I don't know. And also just depend on the context of the cities, and yeah.
Mm, yeah, cool. Okay, I'll go to the next question. So on a practical level, what equity tool / analysis tool do you use to consider and access equity and assess equity in transport?
So I think identifying who has the good access, who has no access is important. So you can reverse it. Like I think I had a pizza here, you can look at who is in the area with no public transport. I mean, you can use a census that gives you a bit of idea who these people are. And most importantly, we ideally, we need to talk to community what their everyday life is. And I think as a built environment professions, we don't write the stories of people enough. I think that's really important, and just to bring the issues more relatable for people who are reviewing the report on, decision makers. I hope that I answered the question okay on that.
Yes, awesome. Okay, thank you. Okay, so next question. So this is from Alistair. He said, I've heard the anecdote that some minority communities don't want improvements to transport. The example was separated bike lanes because it can lead to gentrification, i.e. hipsters moving in and pricing out existing locals. Do you have any comments? And he said this was a USA story.
Yes. So US has definitely, yeah, I hear the story. I think I don't know how to answer to that though. It is true. If you talk to minority communities, they are afraid of being priced out, and I think it's infrastructure project itself has the risk of doing that. So, for instance, if you improve the public transport accessibility in area of low public transport, what it does is it shift the land value, and some people get kicked out, priced out, and that's what essentially happened in, I mean, those who are in Auckland, Possum Bay, it used to be Pacific and Maori community. That's the area, but not anymore. And it's, I think I heard from our treaty partner when they built a motorway in the Freeman's Bay, and that's what happened. A lot of Maori and Pacific communities moved to South Auckland. They basically price out, landlord started to increase the price and they got priced out. So unfortunately, we have a correlation between public transport improvement and gentrification, and that's why I think we need to work with housing policies, and that because often the infrastructure project itself can't really prevent that happening, but what we can do is to consider, and might be right in your report, that's a potential issue, and hope with the hope the decision maker they pick up on that and work on housing policy. And the US, they have the gentrification index. Most states, city level, they have it. Certainly San Francisco, Bay Area, they have the index. If you Google gentrification index, should come up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always a difficult, balance of
Yeah.
wanting to improve these, different parts of the communities, but yeah, not wanting to price out people. So yeah, no, I think that was a great answer. Next question. So it says, great presentation, a lot to think about. Any thoughts about why this is such a neglected area of discussion and planning in Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand compared to the US?
I think that comes down to, I've sort of talked about it, it's the lack of diversity in decision-making process, who has power over who doesn't have power. So Tamika has a really great example, I guess slightly very US context. So Tamika is from Nebraska. Those who know whether Nebraska is an extremely wide area. If you Google Nebraska, you see this typical suburban with happy white people, family. That's the sort of picture you often see, and Tamika often see it. I tried it, and that's true. And then she says, I know what white space looks like, and planning is very wide, and that's how common. And yeah, I think my personal experience, I been to so many meetings. I go into meeting, I'm just only the person of color, and because I'm a social scientist in my training, I always look and who else in this meeting? And I guess might be, as a female colleague, where in the industry is very male dominant. I think you might have this similar experience when you go in a meeting,
Definitely.
I guess.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was just thinking I'm
Yeah.
often, the only woman or one of the only couple women in the room. So yeah, no, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that diversity in those kind of higher up levels, at those decision-making levels as well, is so important to pushing the equity conversation along. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question now. So this question says, can you talk more about the difference between the concepts of transport equity and transport disadvantage, and then in brackets, social exclusion?
So transport equity versus disadvantage. Transport disadvantage. So transport disadvantage to me is like what I'm showing here, public transport. You don't have enough public transport, right? But then I showed you the iceberg. If you start thinking why this certain area do not have transport, and usually there's an answer, they could be considered as undesirable, neglected, and that's often to do with socioeconomic status of the area. It's might be decision makers, they come from really high, high social status. Therefore, they might not be thinking actually they need more public transport. So to me, that's the transport disadvantage. Transport equity is, so I sort of talk about it, but it's one layer and like go further, why you don't have public transport in that area, why, who live there, what's their history, what their socioeconomic status, why they have such a socioeconomic status, and that often comes to history. And our Amiga G, one of the 6 sort of approach she has is we look at the past for future. And I think that's one of transport equity is we look past so that we don't make the same mistake for future.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I think that was a really good explanation. Okay, so next question for you. You've got a lot of questions, so we'll go until the end of the hour. I think we'll be able to get through them. But if anybody has more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them. And if we can't answer them within the session, we'll send out an email. So the next question is, any suggestions on how to engage with demographics which traditionally won't engage until after change is made, i.e. don't get involved earlier?
Yeah, I know. I think that's why I think we should have better engagement strategies, right? And then equity index definitely helps you because it gives you an idea of what type of people your project might be happening. And then basically you can tailor engagement strategy for them. So if you're working, your project is in lower socioeconomics, area of lower socioeconomics, they don't work 9 to 5. They don't, and also they might be working bill to bill. We are really privileged that, you're listening to my presentation and we're getting paid, right? And some people, they just don't have that privilege. And that's why your engagement should have an evening, or might be if they have a specific, strong religious belief, you could engage with the religious leader. And that's typically some community, they listen to them more than politicians, right? I think that's what Jacinda did in a New Zealand COVID vaccination program, if you remember, in New Zealand. And I think vaccination for Pacific and Maori people are lagging. She actually went there. She did a barbecue and do the fui gathering. That's what Pacific community, the Maori community, that's part of their culture. So she did that. So I think we can use that approach. I think some example.
Yeah, I think that's such a important thing, is meeting people where they're at versus trying to get them to come to you. So yeah, thank you for that answer. The next question is from Robin Verstappen, and he says, thanks, this was a great overview. I have a question about your distributional analysis, which focuses on the priority groups. If you also mapped this to the non-priority groups to compare across which domains which domains outcomes are the most inequitable?
Yeah, I think so. We haven't done distribution analysis yet. We are about to. Essentially, yes. It's exactly that. We'll be comparing how distribution will be different between priority groups and non-priority group. So I'm hoping hoping to see how this differ. And I guess one step forward, our San Francisco office looked at toll road scenario in San Mateo Expressway. What they discovered, for instance, often the community live along the motorway. They don't actually benefit from toll road. They just get more burden because it could be increase in pollution and noise. So what they recommended, their conclusion was to give the certain funding, the charges collected by the express road, give to the community for them to use public transport. So I think distribution analysis, what comes after distribution analysis is that what can we do? How we redistribute back to underserved community. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so next question. Okay, so this is a little bit longer, so I will read it all out. So it says, what is your take on equity in emerging technologies? For example, electric vehicles require new infrastructure to be built, but we can't build it everywhere. We need to pick. Most of the time, they will pick with the places that have high demand, mainly will be rich areas. But this may deepen the discrimination and gaps with the new infrastructure, as with new infrastructure may come new opportunities. EVs are not just private cars, they can also be better public transport.
Yeah, I think it's a good question on the EV one. I mean, emerging technology, automated cars, just I will mention about that. It has an equity issue. You might know or not. In America, automated vehicles actually struggling to recognize people of color. What happening is because techies are again very white male dominated. The way they're coding, it's just not recognizing people of color. If you Google, it should come up, and that's very dangerous thing. So that's one thing. And with regard to EV charging, yep, I think it's very difficult. At this moment, I guess low-income people are very unlikely to have EV car, but things might change. I've got a feeling, I believe in putting charging station in lower area of lower socioeconomic status, but also that could trigger gentrification. So I think the best again is go to community, talk to them, what they feel, how they feel. You know, it's at the end of the day, they live there. So I think goes down to better engagement strategy. I think that's what I can think of.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to ask. Okay, so this is from Jill. She says, it's interesting that all quotes by you were women. Do you think that planning and the design of our cities and transport options might be improved if less men were involved in planning?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I think yeah, why not? I think it's true. I unconsciously did. I think it's equity. However, I listen to podcasts, an equity podcast. What his name? He's in the US. He's a guy. He brings real good perspective on it, and he talks of racial equity as well. But I think if female colleagues, well, I guess we are allies, right? If you're a person of color, we know how it feels like to sit the other side of the table. I think that's ultimately happening, I guess, when I refer to when I study. I'm not doing intentionally, but I happen to be in that way. Yeah, but I think definitely diversity is, yeah, I think we need diversity in this industry, 100%. Yep.
That was a really good answer. Okay, we just have a few more questions. So the next one is, with the progression towards more inclusive analysis of how we plan for transport, what barriers do you see in implementing changes on the ground? I love tactical urbanism and trials, but these are soft launches. But are these soft launches the best way?
Soft launches as in, not quite getting.
Like tactical urbanism or
Oh yeah,
yeah, that kind of stuff. So not
yeah,
permanent,
gotcha.
but yeah.
Yeah, I think start with soft launch and test how it goes, I guess. I think that's always a good way. And then I think soft launch often involves more community engagement, I believe. And in that way, I think it's a good way to do it. Yeah, I mean, I guess that Justice 40, it is very big launch. It's coming from federal level. So it's one way of doing it at federal level. Money should go where it needs to go. And I think it can be both way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's such a difficult balance between, the tactical urbanism things and trying to get the community to come along with you, but then also making these sort of um, often difficult political decisions, to put in bus lanes somewhere, put in cycle lanes somewhere, where, people will, for example, the Northern Busway in Auckland, that was a lot of people didn't like that, but now people love it. So it's such a interesting balance we're working with here. Okay, so next question. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. What are some tangible steps we could take in the New Zealand transport planning industry to be able to achieve equity? I'm also a transport planner in New Zealand, so it's great to hear someone speak about this topic.
I think New Zealand has great potential, I think, coming from elsewhere, right? Outsider. I mean, New Zealand's the way to respect multi-value, and that's absolutely fascinating and something I love. So I think we have the way to do it. I think a lot of planners, we know how to, but just not at the moment at like government level. It's coming from like myself or practitioners start to talk about it. I think what we need to do is get it on the government level. I think that's what happened in US. Planners started and states picked up, city level picked up, and the states picked up, and federal level picked up, as you can see in the Justice 40. So I really think New Zealand has a great potential. And when I talk to our interns and grads, they really, I think they feel more comfortable talking about these issues than, people who actually have power. And which is really positive thing because they are next generation. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. This is so next question is from Anonymous, and it says, thank you so much for this awesome presentation. I'm a new Asian immigrant to Australia. In recent years, there is increasing awareness and support of First Nations in Australia, which I think is great and am excited to understand their culture more. However, I feel deeply unfair or left out when I, or immigrants as my situation, am accused of the history that neither of us or our ancestors, I guess, partook in. I'm wondering what is the best way to feel about this. Thank you.
So I think it's, yeah, fascination indigenous. Is I'm studying. I'm luckily I have awesome Maori advisor to learn from. But if you think about this part of land, so I think example in Japan, I mean, I'm First Nation and it's right. I don't often, when I'm I was in Japan or when I'm in Japan visiting my family, I don't think about this because I have a privilege not to think about. But in Australia and New Zealand, we've been colonized. The indigenous people's land were taken from them, and there's a consequence in that on that. So I think we're talking very different dynamics. It's very difficult because immigration can happen in so many ways. People want to study, you come here, or you might be refugee, you don't have nowhere else to go. And when you move to country, yes, it's your decision to move country maybe, and then you have to wonder whether the society has got capability of making fair judgment. And that's really, this is a really difficult question. But I think, I think immigration and indigenous people, very different context we're talking here, because their life, their culture is taken, and that's not their decision to be in that situation.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a tough question to answer, but I think you did well. Okay, so we just have time for one more question. So this is from Alistair. So in Melbourne, for example, the areas of best PT access are inner suburbs with higher density and are predominantly white. Areas of minority or immigrants who can be disadvantaged are typically in the middle or outer burbs. How do we juggle providing better services for those disadvantaged groups with the lower density housing in these areas?
Good question again. Yeah, I think one could be, I think it's just, I think as a practitioner, like we need to engage with the community better to understand. Often, we look at trip burbs into the city, right? And we often forget burb suburb, and that sometimes the trip patterns that happen for low income community. It's so like providing the trip pattern that they require could be, it could be using additional funding to subsidize the movement. I believe in the UK, in London, there's a point they used to do, or they're still doing. I don't remember. Like outer movement is partially subsidized, need to be subsidized. Something like that. I think it requires funding so that their needs will be met. I think it comes down to investment again, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Takeshi, for that awesome thought-provoking presentation. We really appreciated your expertise. This presentation has been recorded, so a recording will be sent out at some point soon. And I'm sure if you want to continue the discussion, Takeshi would be interested in, you can reach out to him or, yeah. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate you coming along. And we'll
Thank you
see
so
you at
much
the
for
next
inviting me.
webinar. Oh my gosh, of course, we are, yeah, we're honored to have you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.